Welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast brought to you by AMPLOS. Dr. Drew Brannon in studio today with Dr. Cory Shaffer. Welcome to the show, sir.
Great to be here, man. Let's do it.
Let's do it. Today's topic, Cory, I'm excited to get into this one. We're going to be focusing on the concept, the construct of mediocrity. And, I don't know how that hits our listeners. They're probably, I would imagine, kind of first reaction is like, well, really? Like, you're going to dedicate a whole podcast to the topic of mediocrity? And yes, we are. And there's a good reason for that. So you want to kind of take the reins here and take us down the path a little bit on how we're going to conceptualize mediocrity today?
Yeah. So I think first and foremost, if our listeners are having any type of reaction to this idea of talking about mediocrity, I want to meet you where you're at. In our industry, we don't spend a whole lot of time studying mediocrity either. What we tend to do is focus in on the highest of high performers and teams and organizations and leaders and so on. We're studying them, right? What can we learn from the best and then try to change our behaviors to match? In this case, though, this centers around a story that I had read, I came across. So I'm going to give credit where credit is due. A guy by the name of Billy Oppenheimer, who's a fantastic social media follow if you're into that sort of thing. He's a writing and research assistant for Ryan Holiday. And he does a really great job of, taking, I think, some of the content that he reads about and researches and just puts it together in a very easy to follow conceptual kind of story, and then here are a couple of takeaways. So he shared a story about movie director Quentin Tarantino. Quick, can you give us a Quentin Tarantino movie, Drew?
Gran Torino.
Okay. That is incorrect.
I know, but it felt right because you got to.
I appreciate you giving me an answer that fast. Okay.
Can I have multiple choice?
Yeah.
or next question.
We'll come back to that. All right. So as the story goes, 17 years old, Tarantino moves to LA. He has these ambitions of being a filmmaker. Okay. He gets a job at a video store, and as he describes it, and this is coming from a podcast episode that Tarantino was on. If I had the podcast, I would point to it, but unfortunately I do not have the name of it. But he says, quote, "I got caught up in the little life there. For a few years, it put my ambitions to sleep because I was happy enough." So one night, he has a buddy who he worked with and lived with. He comes home and just starts venting about life.
Let me interject one thing real quick. So go back and read that line one more time. I think it's super powerful. It put my ambitions to sleep.
Yeah, he said, "I got caught up in the little life there, and for a few years, it put my ambitions to sleep because I was happy enough."
I mean, just to like pause on that for a moment, and I got a feeling there are no shortage of listeners that are tuned in hearing this, that if they're honest with themselves, there's some truth to that in their lives right now. And I think it's important to point out that is not entirely bad, but it sure can prove to be costly.
Sure.
So I think those are some powerful words.
Yeah. So his buddy comes home and just starts ranting about life. Okay. And he goes on, and I'm going to paraphrase here for just to condense this, but he says, at 20, I worked at this place. I hung out with a bunch of guys just like you. Then I worked at this place for 4 years. I hung out with a bunch of guys just like you. Then I worked at this pizza shop for 4 years with a bunch of guys just like you. I've wasted my life hanging out with a bunch of guys just like you. Mm. And as the story goes, Tarantino is about to turn 25 years old at this time. And leading up to this, he said, I was starting to think, what have I done with my life? And so far, nothing. So he said, I'm having my own anxieties about hitting 25, and I'm seeing what it looks like when you're in that situation in your 30s. His buddy who's ranting at him is older. He's in his 30s. So he says, not wanting to be in this situation in his 30s, Tarantino had what he called a, quote, Quentin detest fest. He said, I stayed up all night looking at everything that he's messing up in life, and then I spent the next couple of hours figuring out how I can change it. He said, as opposed to just doing that and going to sleep, forgetting about it and falling back into my routine, I decided to change my life. So the first thing he did was he moved from South Bay to Koreatown. which is closer to the action in Hollywood. Like Hollywood is where he wanted to be, right? The whole ambition here was filmmaking.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes on, not long after moving to the Hollywood area, he said, quote, "I met a guy who wrote low-budget horror movies. Through him, I met other writers. You meet one person, they introduce you to 3 others. Now, all of a sudden, I actually knew people who were making movies." Surrounded by people making movies, Tarantino started writing his own scripts and helping other writers write theirs. Soon, when those writers would get offered jobs rewriting scripts, if they couldn't take it, they'd recommend Tarantino. And within a year and a half of moving into the Hollywood area, Tarantino said, "Literally within a year and a half, I was able to make a living as a writer."
Wow.
So Oppenheimer, I think kind of his genius here and what he does well, he sort of pulls out, here are a couple of takeaways. Here are some lessons or things that we can learn and talk about. And so he starts, of course, with the idea and what you hung on to there, this idea of like putting his ambitions to sleep because he was, quote, happy enough.
Yeah.
Okay. And so he describes, he says, when you're happy enough, when the job, the pay, the circumstances are good enough, psychologist Adam Mastroianni calls this the mediocrity trap. So this is a phrase I had not been familiar with. And it goes on, it says, mediocre situations, quote, keep you forever in their orbit because they never inspire the frustration it takes to achieve escape velocity. I thought
I love all that.
Yeah, so good, right?
Man.
So good. Some really, really good stuff in there. So go ahead, give me some of your reactions first.
Gosh, where to start? But, and I want to, so just quickly, and I know if we don't get moving, we'll never get through the thing, but I do want to rewind for just a moment and just point out the obvious here, or maybe not obvious. This guy picked up his life and went somewhere else. And it wasn't like from, East Coast to West Coast, but I just want to let's not let that be lost in this, in that, we hear people say things oftentimes of like, gosh, like I really want this thing to happen, or I really want this outcome to come my way. And, you get underneath that maybe a little bit. It's like, do you? Like, do you really? What evidence is there in your life that you really want this thing? And, I'm not judging anybody. This is not an endorsement for everyone needs to pick up their life and move somewhere else. But I don't know a stronger demonstration of hey, I want this thing than to move. So I applaud that. I respect the fact he was willing to create that much disruption in his life to go somewhere else. And then, as we get into thinking about okay, well, why is that so important, or what does that do? And there's a powerful example in there of, because he escaped, right?
Yeah.
Well,
and so he goes on, and I think this will help where you're headed. He says to escape the mediocrity trap, you often need a setback. So that might mean, for example, getting fired. A rant like this, probably from a significant person in your life, or back to the original sort of theory here, the psychologist, quote, someone to come in and tell you it's time to start living.
Mm-hmm. Something shakes you up.
Yes.
And, we've done previous podcasts on this too, of the fact that we tend to not do those things very proactively. And that's what he's speaking to there, is because the shakeup can be really painful.
Yep.
It can be really, really painful.
We talked about that as sort of needing a catalyst for growth a lot of the time, where that's, essentially hitting rock bottom. Then it's like, oh, wait, I really do need to do something here.
Yep. And let's say this too, because here's where, to me, Cory, this is really tough, is as you think about periods of time in life for any person, is there something to be said about the fact that sometimes we need periods that are a little smoother and steady and just consistent? Yeah. That's okay. And yet, how do you know the difference between doing that versus the settling part, where I'm accepting mediocrity and I'm too comfortable and I don't have enough velocity to escape with, or the intent or anything like that? It's hard to know the difference sometimes.
It's interesting, because if I think about okay, well, how could this apply to the average person or your own life or whatever? And it's well, I want to feel ambitious in my career.
Sure.
Right. But everything else around that, I want to feel a little bit more steady.
Yeah, good point.
Right. Like I want to be able to come home to, my family and have a little bit of a routine about life. And it doesn't mean that we aren't doing fun things and taking vacations and this and that. But I think for him here, like the key piece of it is he basically, for the very thing he initially moved out there for, just basically got pushed to the side.
Yeah, he wasn't doing it.
Yeah, because he just got so like comfortable almost not doing it. Right. I'm sure how that started was like, well, I just need a job to make ends meet, right, to pay rent, so I'll do that. And then just settled into that lifestyle, right, and that dream or the aspirations of being a filmmaker in his case just sat on the shelf and collected dust.
Because there was security in the continuity that he had.
Yeah.
And although it wasn't like his aspirational life, it was steady. It was reliable.
Yeah, again, like I'm happy enough, right? Like he's probably met good people, and he's got a steady paycheck, he's paying rent, he's got a roof over his head, and food on the table, and all the basics are met, which also supports a lot of the research in this space, which is essentially like, man, as long as the basic needs are met, like most people tend to be just fine.
Yeah, very true.
Right. So I think that's probably a piece of this as well. But
okay, so let's try to drill down on this for our listeners a little bit too. What are some signs or indicators a person could look for that might say, hey, you're comfortable right now. You're not like you're hanging out with your same friends at the pizza place. Like, how do you know?
It's probably hard to, again, do this proactively and realize you can't see the forest through the trees. And this is what I keep going back to. It probably has to do with a feeling or a sense of like purpose. If I feel like I've lost that sense of purpose, like the ambition or the drive, the challenge, anything to feel like I'm progressing in life, that's to me probably the number one indicator.
Yeah, that's a great point.
I don't know what comes to mind for you, but for me, that's, and again, I think my point behind that is though, why is that so hard to recognize? Because most people aren't just sitting around thinking about the purpose of their life.
Yeah.
Very frequently.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. And I think relative to that or related to that would be, you can pick your term here, whether it's trend lines or trajectory. And if you're honest with yourself, like what is the trend of the things you're pursuing? And are you kind of flat? Is there much, passion behind it, whatever it is. And I think if you look at trend lines, they're usually pretty telling. And that doesn't mean like, because I think what we have to kind of balance the tension of this here as well is it doesn't matter what career you're in, doesn't matter what industry you're in. There are periods of time where, man, you're just grinding. Although you're building mastery, we hope, you aren't necessarily getting short-term results or returns that tell you that or that confirm that. You're just, your head's down, you're just going.
Yeah. Yeah. I just love how the mediocrity trap, I think, is a really fascinating, like the terminology of that, the definition there and how he write, like keeping you in their orbit because they never inspire the frustration to achieve escape velocity is such a...
It's rich.
It's a very, very compelling line. And maybe that connects and will resonate with some of our listeners. But
and let's talk about the escape velocity here for a second, because I think maybe one of the goals I would have for this podcast is that someone might be able to generate the escape velocity they need without suffering. Right? Or without it costing them dearly in the form of some kind of shakeup. So I think like hopefully as you're hearing some of these things and you're thinking about the mediocrity trap and you're thinking about, is that you? Are you in it? Have you tried to get out? What's keeping you from trying? That type of thing. But we'd love to help people avoid some discomfort.
Well, and so, I wanted to ask you, like you and I have both met people, worked with people across industries, I'm sure, who are probably in the middle of this mediocrity trap.
For sure.
So what's it like to work with those people and how do you navigate it? How do we help them?
Yeah. Well, let's just get right down to it. I think one of the most common reasons people get in what we're describing is they've gotten to a place in their career where they're being compensated at a level where they don't know how to walk away. They aren't happy necessarily, but they don't know what they can go and do differently and still earn in the same orbit of what they're currently earning with their employer. Mm-hmm. And that's real life. That is real life. And so I think what that amounts to, the net of that is they don't have the escape velocity because they're not sure or they're not unhappy enough to generate it.
Yeah. Maybe you've come across this. How do we end up sort of being the, what's the right phrasing here? The kickstart.
Oh yeah.
Right. To potentially be the escape velocity that they need.
Man, that's tough because you also don't want to be that person who helps someone generate the escape velocity and 6 months later they're still unemployed.
Well, but I think, back even to the original story here, right? It was maybe remove some of the what I'm sure was like the sarcasm, the negativity, the statements that were deliberately, supposed to hit Tarantino in such like a negative way from his buddy. Right, that's what he was doing. He was basically just calling him out and putting him down.
Yeah.
Remove that from the equation. All he was doing was offering him perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. Very true.
Like strip away all, I'm sure, some of the language around it and so on. And it's just like, hey, man, you have not done what you said you wanted to do, period.
Mm-hmm.
Like, look at your life right now. Mm. Right. So my point is, that's what we do is we just try to
truth tellers.
Tell the truth. And even if we don't know the truth, we're trying to at least ask the questions to get them to come to the truth themselves.
Right.
Or offer perspective and just try to look at things from different angles and different perspectives, different lenses, so that people can come to these conclusions themselves.
Yep.
Right. Like, again, I don't have all the details and all the nuances of your situation, but I know how to ask the right questions to help you.
Yes.
Sort of like follow the breadcrumbs.
The place I try to take someone in that situation is down one of three avenues. And so I try to really spell out for them, and I think this is true for any person that might be in the mediocrity trap is, and there could be more, there probably are, but the three avenues, the three paths that I think are on the table there for any person would be, number one, you try to find a way to make the situation better. Like you try to find a way to improve your current situation so that you feel differently, more positively about it. Sometimes you can do that, sometimes you can't. Number two would be you decide you're going to be accepting of it. Don't really recommend that, but people make those choices all the time. Mm. That, this is, I'm mediocre, this is mediocre. However, the benefits outweigh the costs for me right now, so I'm going to keep doing it. Okay, you can decide that. Number three would be the example we're talking about here where you decide, I'm out. Like, I'm tired of accepting mediocrity in my life. I'm tired of not doing what I said I was going to do or existing within a role, organization, a team, whatever it might be, that truly doesn't align to who I want to be, how I want to be, that type of stuff. You do something different. Yeah. And those are the three paths I think that are available to a person.
Yeah. Or even if I think you can probably come across a decision where somebody's like, okay, I think I know that, let's say, getting out is probably the right thing just based on the timing of it or life or whatever. Like, maybe I can't do it right now, but how do I start like preparing for that? Mm-hmm. What changes can I make now, so to set myself up for success when I know I can, or whatever it might be. And that's a good segue into like the second takeaway here that I wanted to make sure we hit. And, what you're alluding to, like getting out. Okay. So Oppenheimer here references James Clear, who we've talked about on the podcast, author of Atomic Habits. He says, James Clear writes that the most reliable way to create better habits is to go to, quote, where your desired behavior is the normal behavior.
Yeah.
So it goes on to document, says Walt Disney moved to Hollywood after a decade of trying and failing to make it as a cartoonist in Kansas City. Bob Dylan moved to New York City to pursue his music ambitions. Julia Child moved to Paris and discovered her culinary ambitions. Tarantino moved to Hollywood to wake up his filmmaking ambitions. So that's the kind of the point here, right? In terms of like getting out is
you left off. I moved to Norman, Oklahoma in 2008 for sports psychology.
Hey, tell us the story, Drew. Come on, man.
Believe it or not, that was the main thing that took me to Norman. Although there are some great folks there.
Yeah, but the whole idea here again, just being like, okay, well, if the goal to be out here was to be a filmmaker, then let me go get in the heart of that space.
Yeah.
So from there, kind of come back to our conversation just around how do we help people. I think this is what's challenging though, is, in terms of like industry, it's not, I don't know about you. I've never worked with, an artist or a musician and said like, hey, you got to go to New York City or LA. Like that's where it is.
Yeah, right. But I think the theme there, of course, that we're talking about is, are you putting yourself in the company of people who are pushing in life, are they pushing? Are they, and, can you always find someone who's in like your specific lane? Like, not necessarily unless you're maybe willing to move, but you certainly can surround yourself with people who are hungry, who are not settling for the status quo, who are making an attempt to improve, grow.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, there's a much greater likelihood you aren't doing those things either.
Right.
And that's what Clear speaks to.
Yeah. And that's the ultimate point here, right? And obviously in Tarantino's space, it's just like, okay, then I need to go where people are in the filmmaking business.
Yeah.
And the thing that I want to do is the thing that they're doing every day.
Yep.
So it almost is just going to get forced out of you at some point, right?
Right.
Like you're deliberately inserting yourself into that culture. Yeah, it's interesting. This is why it's so important. I think the work that we do in organizations or with teams is if you establish that right culture, you can absorb a lot in terms of like the type of person you're bringing in, the personality almost, because it's like, hey, our culture is good enough that you will either adopt this same mindset and these same behaviors, and you're going to become a high performer too.
Yep.
Or you're going to consistently like go against the grain and fight this and push back on it, and you will stand out like a sore thumb, and we won't even need to force you to leave. Like you will want to leave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right.
Yep. Yeah. Great point. And I think, there's so many examples of this, right? And so his thing was obviously he'd set out to be a filmmaker, and he wasn't doing that, but it gets super, super basic. Like how many times have we heard people talk about how, yeah, I'm not really working out, but I kind of want to, all right, who are you hanging out with? I doubt you're hanging out very frequently or consistently with people who are doing a lot of that.
Right.
If you were, I bet they'd be pulling you into it.
Yeah, no doubt.
So it's as practical and basic as that, of like the things in your life, whether you call them target behaviors or kind of aspirational habits, whatever they are, if you don't have a pretty kind of close circle of folks that are doing those things, you're making it hard on yourself. Mm-hmm. You're making it much harder.
Yeah. Yeah. I actually had a conversation recently with a college athlete. Okay. This is, to me, it was pretty fascinating, very interesting story, and kind of the intersection of this conversation. So he started out junior college player. Okay. And immediately is really good, spends a couple years in junior college, becomes like an All-American, has a couple extra years of eligibility, goes off to like a mid-major Division I school. So from this was D3, excuse me.
Wow.
D3.
Man.
Like All-American stud.
Yeah.
Okay. Goes on to a mid-major school and has some success. Really good player again. Okay. Has one more year of eligibility. And in the background, I think he's always sort of knew, and part of him always sort of saw himself as like, hey, I know what I am, related to my sport, probably not playing professionally. I'm just going to do the best that I can, play it as long as I can. It's going to help me pay for school and so on, right? So like good kid, good head on his shoulders, got really into school, understands and knows what his like future career trajectory is and stuff, which is pretty amazing at 22, 23 years old. Has an extra year of eligibility though. Found a program at Clemson where credits would transfer and so on. So decides to make the jump because basically he's like, I want to keep surrounding myself with the next group of who's really good.
Yeah.
Like, you know what I mean? Like
yeah.
I did the low level thing, check. Right? I made this big jump up and I was really good, check. There's a part of him that still feels like I came here to see what I'm capable of doing. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? Like I want to scratch that itch. I want to see what it's like to be a part of like a really good program and really good players and so on.
Yeah.
I thought that was really cool, man.
Yeah, I agree.
Like nobody's forcing him to do that. That is solely now what he was struggling with then was just kind of like, okay, I'm doing this. And yeah, I get this is probably it for me. And I have no idea what my role is going to be. I hope, I'm in the conversation. I'm an everyday player. but I also know kind of what's next.
Yep.
But then there was the question of like, but what if I have a really good year?
Yeah.
What if then essentially like I haven't reached the finish line? What if major league teams start contacting me about moving on to the next level and so on? Like, what do I do then? I'm like, buddy, I can't tell you that. Right. But if you still want to scratch the itch, then I think you probably know what you need to do. Again, it was just really fascinating to hear somebody who was so deliberately, like it was energizing to hear somebody who was so deliberately seeking out that environment where he felt like he could be pushed. And he was almost interested, like weirdly I want to know what the line is for me. When am I not good enough?
Yeah. Man, I love that too. And it's totally in sync with the regret research on the things that people regret at the end of their life is what they didn't do.
Yep.
Right. They regret because they wonder. Well, this sounds like this kid will not wonder.
Right. Yeah. And back to Oppenheimer's post here, he says, if you're in the mediocrity trap, if your ambitions have been put to sleep, if you've been trying and failing for years, you got to go to where what you desire is what's normal.
Yeah.
Right. So that's what he did, is just like, okay, I know I can do this. And if I stay here, I think there's enough awareness and some wisdom there to recognize like, I'm probably going to get bored.
Yeah.
So like, let's just jump up another level and see what that's like.
Push myself, see what I'm capable of. Yeah. I love how you said that too, of like, let's go find out where the line is.
Yeah.
And that, that's a really powerful thought because, and this is obviously not a criticism to anybody that's listening as the last thing we want to do, but like there are some folks listening to this podcast right now who aren't pursuing that. Like you haven't thought, it's been a while since you've thought about the line. And when we say the line, what are we talking about is like your capability limits.
Yep.
Like how far can you push it to the point where you are out of your league, you're out of your capability?
Yeah. And it's almost like, man, you imagine Tarantino, he finally gets into a room where like he's the lowest guy on the totem pole. You know what I mean? Like now I'm actually in a room with a bunch of writers.
Yeah.
And I know nothing. And this is what I want to be doing though. Like how energizing that probably was. And there were elements of that and just hearing from this kid, which I thought was really cool. Like how much gratitude there was to now like be on a field where he felt challenged every day.
Yeah.
And there was like some anxiety,
Yep.
because he had never not known anything other than like being in the starting lineup and playing every day and this and that. But there was some excitement too of like, I got the sense reading between the lines of like, this is exactly what I was hoping it would be, and it's making me better.
That's cool. And so you got to pull on there too. Let's say it, this interesting blend of ego strength and humility. You got to have it.
Yeah.
And, so just so we're clear, not ego strength, which is essentially your internal belief that you can do it, and humility of like a willingness to put yourself out there.
Yeah.
And not having to constantly be in control.
Yeah, that's what I described as like this weird excitement around, I wonder if this is where I fail.
Yeah.
Like that's almost how he was approaching it and didn't know, which was kind of cool because I at least floated it for him. I'm like, well, what if this year goes great, man?
It's fun to think about. All right, put us back on the path here.
Yeah, no, I mean, again, just back to clear, desired behavior is normal behavior. I think you did a good job here of at least referencing the idea or the example of like, hey, if you want to work out, well, are the people that you surround yourself with, do any of them work out? Because if they don't, then you probably won't either.
Right.
So this actually gets back to something we've talked about. I'm sure we've talked about it on the podcast, 300 something episodes, you lose sight of what you haven't discussed, right? But the famous quote from motivational speaker Jim Rohn, you're the average of the 5 people you spend your most time with. Done some research on this recently just to see like, is there anything that actually backs that? And there is, and I didn't dive too deep into the research, but there was one study that jumped out. Harvard psychologist by the name of Dr. David McClellan researched this and did a 25-year study and found that the people you associate with, which is called your reference group. So in this case, he's not saying that's 5, but just people who you closely align yourself to and associate with, determine 95% of your success or failure in life.
Ooh, that's a big number.
That's a very big number now. The nitty-gritty of that and how he's determining that and so on. But this was a 25-year study. Right?
Yeah.
This was longitudinal. I think there's plenty of time to see like, hey, what happened here?
Yeah.
But there's truth to it. So, I think ultimately this is Clear's point, is, and your point, right, is like, you have to surround yourself with people who are doing the thing that you want to do, or the type of person that they are, that you're trying to become.
Right.
If you're the only one in the room that's like that, you're not moving the needle.
No, because and we got to differentiate this too. So let's go back to that example of if you're the only person in the group or in the room who's doing this thing, you have to differentiate between behavior adherence and behavior improvement. And what I mean by that is like, if no one else is doing it, will you continue doing it? Well, it really depends on how disciplined you are. You might. Mm-hmm. You might. So that's more of an adherence or a compliance category here. That's not really what we're looking for. It's better than not doing it, but what we're missing there obviously is improvement or growth. If you're the only one doing it, will you keep doing it? Possibly. Will you get better? Will you feel challenged? Will you stretch? Probably not.
Yeah.
On a consistent basis, you probably aren't.
Yeah, 100%.
And so just recognize how important it is, not just in order to like get you going or keep you going, but to make you better.
Yeah. Yeah. So, if this is you and everybody in terms of the behavior they're trying to adopt or improve on or whatever, there's a million different examples. Mm-hmm. The working out one's very low hanging fruit. I mean, join a gym, right? There are other people at the gym. Better yet, do it with somebody that a friend of yours or something if you can. I know you've been in a running group or just a group of guys
for years, man.
Work out and do stuff together, right? Yeah. Like how accountable does that keep you?
Yeah, very.
That's probably low hanging fruit in terms of examples. And we're not going to dive into 50 of them, but I think that's the challenge is, can you either go to a place where the desired behavior, again, is normal behavior, or surround yourself with people where that's true as well.
Yeah. And related to that is, have you shared with someone, like I think one of the things he did right there was he told people who he wanted to be and what he wanted to do. And so we've talked about that plenty of times, of the importance of sharing, which then triggers the accountability. Mm-hmm. I mean, had he not shared that guy wouldn't have really been able to put him in check.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, what's really hard about this, and this, we can head in this direction and maybe push to a close here on the conversation, but what's really hard about it for me is the statement of, well, he wasn't doing any of this because he was happy. Like, that's hard.
Yeah. I know, because happy's good.
Yeah, happy is good, man. Like,
especially in this negative mindset, negative world we live in.
Right. Like if you're enjoying life, like there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
Again, I think the only challenge is, can you be happy but also feel like you're tapping into that purpose, or you're pursuing something better for your life or whatever it is? I think that's the challenge and the rub that we're looking for.
Yeah.
Is a better balance between the two. But again, that's the part, even for me, just from the start, where I struggled for a second here, was just like, man, like if you're happy, why are we picking apart somebody's happiness? And you know what I mean? It's just hard to wrap my mind around that.
I do think happy is an interesting word though, because agreed, it's certainly a good thing. Like we want people to be happy, but let's also recognize human nature, and that one of the things that tends to make us happy is comfort.
Yeah, no doubt. Yeah. Well, and again, the actual phrase was, I was happy enough.
Yeah. Right. And so when we're comfortable, it's like, well, what makes you happy? Like, why are you happy? Well, and one of the common ways people talk about why they're happy is they don't have a lot of things that are bothering them at any given time. It's like, hey, I don't have a lot of challenges, stressors, et cetera, on the radar right now. Like, yeah, it's good. Things are good. Now, in time, though, that's a recipe for people to eventually feel some measure of regret.
Yeah.
If we're being honest.
The tone of it, I think you're right, is just like, I was comfortable.
Yeah, totally.
I was almost complacent. But again, I do want to come back to, because it's nice to hear a story like this, where the mindset wasn't the reverse of like, well, I'll just work hard and then I'll achieve some success and like, then I can settle in and be happy.
Yeah.
This is not the case. It was, hey, I'm happy, but I think I can do more in life.
Yeah, it's good.
All right. So I wanted to come back around to that, because I feel like that's a relevant piece of it. Not something we talk a ton about necessarily on the podcast, but
yeah, we certainly are not knocking the idea of being happy.
No doubt. Yeah, right. To me, the perfect blend is, hey, can you be happy but also feel like you're pursuing something?
Yeah.
Right. And if that pursuit comes at the expense of your happiness, maybe you're not pursuing the right thing.
But yeah, and one final thought on that, you see this dynamic as well is, well, if and when people are generally happy in their life, they aren't going to be eager to give that up. And so you can see how the whole tone and emotion of happiness can create a holding pattern.
Yeah.
Because if I disrupt something, one of, not the only one, but one of the risks I run is I forfeit my happiness. And most people don't want to do that.
Yeah. Well, and the science here and related to goal pursuit, goal achievement, again, if you don't enjoy the process, then the destination is going to be pretty hollow.
Yes.
Right. And that's why I said very specifically, like, if in the process of that pursuit you lose the happiness, then you probably didn't go on the right pursuit. You followed the wrong path.
Yep.
But maintaining that level of happiness while still doing the hard thing, doing the work, whatever it is, like, that's the key I think we're all, sort of after.
Yep. Okay. How do we close this thing up, Doc?
Great question, man. I hope just, enough of the conversation put our listeners into hopefully a little state of reflection, right? Especially thinking about some of the language that we used here, the idea of like the mediocrity trap.
Yep. Good phrase.
Am I there? Have I ever been there? What is that like? What's it been like? That escape velocity that we talked about. Is that something I need? Or again, at least be able to connect and understand that somewhere I've been and, hey, yeah, that language resonates. The other piece being, of course, the James Clear stuff, go, to where your desired behavior is a normal behavior, surround yourself with the right people, all those kinds of things. If there's something that you want to do, but you have struggled to make progress, maybe that's why.
Yeah. Right.
That could potentially be a stone that you haven't quite turned over yet.
And let's be clear about this too, though, Cory, is just going there won't fix it.
Yeah, no.
Can't just show.
I'm here now, LA. Like,
if it's not a field of dreams scenario where if you show up, it will happen type deal.
Right.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really powerful language. Those are all powerful language examples in there, and I think our listeners know themselves and they know how that sits with them as they reflect on it. And the challenge I would just issue here is human nature can sometimes be, as you hear things like this, to be thinking about someone else. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Don't think about who this applies to, or at least suspend that for a moment and start with yourself if you don't mind. Just think about you and how this may apply to kind of your world at any given moment, at this moment. And then once you've given that a healthy reflection, it's fine to kind of move on and consider others as well, but start with yourself. That's the place we like people to begin. Okay. So with that said, thank you as always for tuning into the Growth Project, and we will look forward to our next conversation. In the meantime, we always appreciate your feedback and reviews. You can find us both on Apple Podcast and Spotify. Please let us know how we're doing and how the Growth Project is contributing to your life. Thank you.